Welcome back to TimeOut with the SportsDr podcast, where life, sports, and medicine intersect. We're very glad that you continue to support this podcast. You can get the information on any platform where podcasts are played, as well as getting the video content on YouTube. But if you want to just get one place to find all the content, go to my website at Dr.Derrick, and you will find everything on that website. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. So welcome back to another episode of Time Out with the Sports Doctor, and we have another very interesting guest for you today. My namesake, Dr. Derrick Robinson. He is an author. He is a physician, an ER physician. He is the vice president and chief medical officer of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, not Mississippi. He is an associate professor at the University of Illinois. He is my personal mentor and friend. Hey, welcome to the podcast.
Doc, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
It's a pleasure, man. So before we even get started, I have to say thank you because I feel that the trajectory of my life and the course of my medical career has largely been impacted due to, not only your service, not only the trail that you blazed ahead of me, but also the hand that you reached back when it was my time. So just a little bit of the backstory. We're both graduates of Xavier University of Louisiana, both graduates of Howard University College of Medicine. And I believe you were 3 or 4 years ahead of me. But when it was my time to graduate from Xavier and interview at Howard, you were the student government president. You were president of your class. And I remember coming up for my interview. You met me, you took me around, you showed me around. And I know the impact that had, on my career. So I just want to say thank you before we even get started with this interview.
Dr. Burgess, you're more than welcome. I do remember that. And, it was just the natural thing to do. That's what we did. We reached back to folks that are coming up behind us, be sure they know the lay of the land and get a nice, warm welcome. And certainly that's what I wanted for you to have at that time. And more importantly, or just as important, individuals did it for me. And I think that's part of the conversation that we'll have today. I've got my own story in terms of how folks that were before me made sure that I had a smooth path and journey to medical school, so that I could settle in, because it's hard enough, right? And so,
Absolutely.
We want to ensure that we, help people be successful. And so you've certainly done a remarkable job. You're an orthopedic surgeon, not a lot of folks that look like you in the field, so right. I'm sure you go to conference after conference and look around, you go to the hospital, you go in the OR. It's a walk. And we appreciate the service that you provide to the communities there in Mississippi. Is definitely needed. We definitely want to see your continued success, because it's, as you're doing even with this podcast, you're not only change the lives of others through the work that you do with your gifted hands, but you also do it through the way that you reach out to young people in the community and serve as a living model of what they can become. So thank you for your service.
No, thank you. And, I feel like the training that we received, especially under J.W. Carmichael, right, at Xavier, it was competitive, but we were competing to improve each other. It was never cutthroat. Like I have to, get this information and keep it from my fellow man. It was always coming together in those study groups and coming together in the modules, to be able to work together, meeting at the library, studying all night for these tests. And I felt like through those experiences, it built a community. And then once you leave that place, when you see somebody else and you can identify with the struggle and know what they went through, you want to always help them out. So I think that's just really the spirit of Xavier, the spirit of HBCUs overall.
It is, and that legacy of collaboration, I think, continues under the current pre-med director, Cabardis, down at Xavier. And I think for many of us, it took leaving Xavier and going to other environments and interacting with students who went to college at different institutions to understand how significantly different the environments were. And like you, I reflect back on that experience with a lot of positivity. And even going through the medical school process, you recognize that you have friends all over the country, and every area code, it seemed like, from Xavier, that are having their experience at different institutions, and you could reach out to them and talk and be supportive even from that perspective. So very powerful experience. And I know we want to see more individuals have access to that kind of educational opportunity.
Absolutely. Now, one thing when I think about your career, the word leadership, I mean, from the fraternity all the way through, as I mentioned, being the president in medical school, and then continuing to be a leader in your community and in the medical field. So, what is leadership and what does that mean to you, number one? And what along the way shaped you into become a leader?
Yeah, great question. I think leadership is at its core service. It's putting the interests of others before yourself. It's being prepared. It's being empathetic. It's having a vision for the future. And it is building a level of trust with other individuals such that they will follow you forward, even when the path ahead has some uncertainty embedded in it. And I will say that there are a lot of things I think that have contributed to my journey and the opportunities that I've had to be engaged in leadership. And that's from, family upbringing, faith, the time that I spent in church. You mentioned the fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated provided a great training ground for me as an undergraduate. And I think many of our other Divine Nine organizations provide that similar opportunity for young people to see professionals who are further ahead in their career operating at a level that is appropriately advanced, but also sets the model for what they should aspire to become. And one of the things that I learned along the path is that it's often that you're called to leadership versus, you want to be leader of this and you want to be leader of that. And I sort of adopted that approach of being called to leadership. I think it helps you remain humble. Certainly, you need to have some energy and fire in the belly and a willingness to be a good leader and to go forward. But you also want to ensure that that experience is less about you,
right,
and more about what you've been called to do, and how you can be of service to others and achieve the objectives and the outcomes that are set forth.
So, your path through medicine is Improbable MD. So we're going to hear about the path to medicine, I'm sure. But, as an ER physician, you still are an ER physician and still practicing. However, you devoted a large part of your career to being an advocate for not only minorities, but an advocate for your patient on the insurance side, which is kind of foreign, almost a foreign land for most physicians. So kind of talk about that experience.
Yeah. So let me start by saying I immensely cherish the privilege of being a physician and caring for patients. It's a responsibility and opportunity like none other. One of the things that I learned through my experience serving as president of student council in medical school and some subsequent opportunities was that there was a different set of skills that would be necessary in order to be able to affect change at scale. And so, to make that concrete, I sat on the accreditation committee, the LCME accreditation committee for Howard's medical school. And around that board, that table, you had, leadership from the medical school, the dean's office, leadership from the university, from the faculty practice plan, from the hospital. And I noticed that, folks were speaking different languages and had different perspectives. And that planted a seed to me that, hey, I may need some additional training and education to help me be a leader in spaces like this. This is different than what we get in medical school. And so as I was finishing medical school, decided that, hey, I think I want to do an MBA program once I finish residency. So that was part of the journey that I had. But also during my residency training in emergency medicine, I got a chance to take care of patients from all walks of life, minor injuries, life-threatening medical concerns, things that you see that never hit the news, but are very prevalent and pervasive that we see all the time. And one of the things that I realized with that experience was that there were some things that were beyond the reach of the hands of medicine and healthcare that needed to be addressed. And those things would require work in the space of advocacy and policy and the like. And so I had the privilege of getting involved in organized emergency medicine, making a lot of trips to Capitol Hill, understanding how to interface with legislative staff and legislators and doing that at the state level as well. And it really sparked an interest and helped me build some skills and experience in that space. And so it's a combination of that and then the subsequent business school training and some other things along the way that really prepared me to not only be an effective leader at the bedside, an effective clinician at the bedside, but also to see how you take those experiences and use them as catalysts to make changes at a system level that will allow you to impact the lives of maybe initially hundreds, thousands, and then millions of individuals. And so,
Right.
over the course of my career, having worked as a regulator for a period of time, scale of impact, having worked with the Hospital Association and the state, impact at scale, and then working for very large health insurance company, similar opportunities. And so I've seen that as part of the calling, part of the mission to be engaged in both of those spaces simultaneously.
Yeah. Now, how prominent are physicians in that space with large insurance companies?
I think physicians are definitely present in insurance companies. There's certainly a role there with some of the care management and utilization management functions that they have. Probably less rare as you move up within those organizations, having physicians engaged in leadership. I think we've seen that evolve some over time. We've also seen that happen within hospitals and health systems, where
Right.
in some instances we see more physicians engaged in leadership there. And then even as we look at it on the legislative side, we see more physicians getting involved in politics, for example. I think physicians are kind of catching on that there are some ways that they can contribute uniquely outside of just direct clinical care. And that's
Right.
not to diminish direct clinical care either, because
Right.
it's essentially important. And we certainly need to have individuals providing great care to our patients.
But I think the importance of having physicians in the decision making process, because we know that physicians and business people sometimes don't really see eye to eye on, and especially don't really understand the daily issues that you go through as a practitioner or in the emergency room or in the operating room. So to have a physician voice to help as far as a leadership role, I think that's key and very, especially to impact change in the medical field.
I agree. I agree.
Now, tell us about, as I go through your resume, you see diversity and health equity. Why is that so important to you?
Well, I will say that my life experience taught me a lot growing up. There were disparities that I saw in many of the different social determinants of health and inequities that I saw that I didn't have the vocabulary to describe as
Right.
I was growing up, looking at my own family and looking at my own community. But the contrast and the lessons and the longitudinal, multi generational impact have carried with me along the way. And those experiences, coupled with the humbling experience of becoming a physician and providing care for patients, and as you know, asking patients at times to launch valiant, extraordinary efforts to heal from illnesses or injuries, really bringing it all together kind of makes really real the challenges that we see with ensuring that everyone has an opportunity, a fair opportunity to be as healthy as possible, and what
Right.
the drivers are that impact some of the disadvantages that communities face. And so having seeing things from that perspective, the personal experience, seeing it through a healthcare lens, but then also understanding those very important other levers around government and policy, to me, just kind of, being engaged in health equity just makes a lot of sense, because we're familiar with the social determinants of health, but the social determinants of health are impacted by the political determinants of health, which are heavily involved with, voting, government, and policy. And so to affect that change, you need to kind of understand how those things interface together. And when you're in a position where you can make a difference, you want to be prepared to make that difference, to do the right thing that's going to help improve health outcomes.
Yeah. And, especially now as we move into the post pandemic era, post COVID era, I think some of the health disparities that we knew existed are more prevalent or more prominent now. So, how would you speak to like a practicing physician now about what active role we can play on a day-to-day basis to help with the health disparities that we see?
Sure. So, as you noted, we've had endemic, long standing disparities in the prevalence of chronic conditions especially in the Black and Brown communities and Native American communities, whether it's diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, renal disease. You can go on and on and on. And the pandemic demonstrated to us how fragile the state of health of our community was. And so I think now it's really important for practicing physicians and other practicing healthcare providers to ensure that as we look at the quality and safety of care that we're delivering, that we look at different patient sociodemographics to ensure that we are both delivering care in a way that's going to ensure that outcomes are equitable, and that also we look at the health status of our patients and break them down by those demographics as well. Because we have to ensure that we are measuring the things that we want to improve. And I think we have to also be humble enough to appreciate that our system of care does not deliver services to patients in a uniformly fair fashion. And then also there are some challenges that bump up right against the healthcare delivery system that create some unfair barriers to patients. And so we also have to think about how do we meet those patients where they are to ensure that their needs are met. And then also just appreciate that we're not infallible. We are humans. And so we bring to our workplace our lived experiences, and those can come with positive and negative biases that can impact the health of our patients and the care that we deliver. And so we want to be able to have the safeguards in place that are necessary to kind of check those and test our mission and what it is that we strive to do against what those outcomes are, and then be able to close a gap if a gap exists. But if we approach it from the assumption that there is no gap and that we do the best for everyone, then we don't provide ourselves with an opportunity to ensure that the work that we're doing collectively as a healthcare team is advancing equity for the patients in the communities that we serve.
If you're enjoying this episode, don't wait to the end to share it. Share it now. Share this with a friend or a colleague that you think might find value in this information. And then also make sure that you click and leave us a 5-star review and give us feedback, because we really value your feedback and your input. Now back to the episode. Right. And I think that acknowledging that there is a gap is one of the keys that we seem to still struggle with. And if you don't acknowledge it, then how do you address it?
And honestly, the truth is we shouldn't struggle with acknowledging that there is a gap. That is well established.
Yeah.
It's no longer an issue that we need to study. It's an issue of how do we effectively mitigate and close that gap. And that's something that we have to do with mutual understanding and humility. This is not about vilifying any individual or a group of individuals, but it is ensuring that we acknowledge the state of healthcare and the state of our society. And I think the reality is that our healthcare delivery system is not that different than our society, which is not that different than what we see in law enforcement or in banking and lending or all these different sectors. They're comprised of the fabric of our communities and the fabric of our nation. And so we want to be sure that we don't put blinders on and assume that just because we are, physicians and we put on white coats and walk into a healthcare setting, that environment and culture is vastly different than that of the communities that we live and work in.
Yeah, that's a great example. I like the way you made that comparison between the community, because truly the community, and that was one thing with COVID, what was going on in the community. If you weren't seeing it in the hospital, just wait a couple of days, because if people were out and doing a lot, we would see how closely that would impact what was going on in the hospital. So
yeah, and one other thing that struck me during the pandemic as well was the fact that I think one important lesson it taught us was the importance of not ignoring what's happening in vulnerable communities, right?
Right.
Because when we didn't know exactly what to do to protect ourselves from the virus, and then we had shortages of PPE, and we didn't really know a lot of things, right? We saw contagion move from vulnerable populations to privileged populations right there in a healthcare setting, right? You're an orthopedic surgeon. I'm sure you've gone in and seen patients that came in for fracture reduction or
absolutely.
Something else. And by the way, they had COVID, right? A lot
Yep.
of folks get exposed. So that I think was a very important lesson to remind us that we have to be concerned about the health of everyone, not just globally, but also locally in our communities.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So now let's transition to your book. Number one, congratulations. This is your first book that you've written,
Thank
correct?
you. Yeah. This is my
Yeah.
first book, and for the audience is a copy of the cover here, Improbable
Yeah.
MD, from the Bayou to the Boardroom. Published it in September of last year, so it's available in hardback, paperback, ebook, as well as audiobook, which I
Nice.
finished recording earlier this year, so it's available on Audible and some of the other platforms that are out there.
So, what inspired you first to write a book? Like you mentioned, you're a busy man, a family, a professor, administrator,
Yeah,
swim coach,
yes.
swim. You got
It's
a lot of hats that you
a
wear.
lot going on. It is a good question. I didn't. If you had asked me 5 years ago if I imagined that I was would have a book published, that many years later, I would say I don't think so. I would say it was a combination of factors. One is, prior to having kids of my own, I was very deeply engaged in mentoring, both here locally in Chicago with our Kappa League program, as well as nationally with Fraternities Achievement Academy program, working with college students who are going to graduate and professional school. So I've always taken those opportunities to be engaged in outreach and supporting the community, in part because I gained so much from the generosity of others along my journey as well. And I dial back some of that as I've grown into being a parent and having parenting responsibilities, as well as expanded responsibilities with work. So one, there was a thirst to engage with individuals at scale and to help share my story as a way of helping others be their best. During the pandemic, there was a tremendous need for information, tremendous need for hope as people struggled with many of the illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths that they saw in their community and in their families. And so that stretched me pretty thin. It also stretched my wife, who is a physician, thin as well. And I thought there was a need to help inspire and lend that hope to communities across the country as well. And so I said, hey, I think I'm going to grab some time to write a book. And so over the Christmas holidays and beginning in December of 2020, I leaned into that project and got that writing started. And to be honest with you, I felt an obligation to tell my story in a way that would ensure that others could identify and relate to that and be inspired. I think often, when individuals see you walk in the hallway, right, and they're like, man, he's a doctor, he's a orthopedic surgeon. In that moment, it's hard to understand what your journey to reaching that really, storied career location was. And so if we're going to ensure that people who are coming behind us have the tools and resources that they need to be successful, we've got to figure out how do we tell that story in a way that allows them to relate to it, to learn from the lessons that we've experienced along the way. The other thing that was really cool in writing the book was it gave me a great opportunity to reflect on all the people that I reached out to along the way. When doors were closed, when I was struggling to figure out what the next steps were going to be, when I was getting all those thin envelopes in the mail when I applied to medical school, thin envelopes were not good. Now people get their notifications by email and on computer. We had email back then, but how do you deal with that? How do you bounce back? And I learned some important lessons along my journey. And one of the major lessons that I share in the book is the importance of reaching out to building a network and reaching out to that network and nurturing those relationships over the years as well. Because I found that individuals will share with you their successes and their challenges and their failures if you ask them, And one of the things my mother used to say, and I'm trying to get the saying right, because it usually always preceded me maybe getting in trouble or getting a spanking or something like that. But it's best to learn lessons from the mistakes of other people than having to learn those lessons the hard way on your own. So if you see somebody else get in trouble for doing something, don't do what they did. They'll turn around and do the same thing, and then you have to learn the hard way. And then, if you take that lesson to the next level, you then see that there are some lessons that you can't afford to learn the hard way, because when you learn them, the implications are irreparable to your career. They may land you in a very bad spot that you learned a lesson, but you're like forever or for a long time harmed by it.
Right.
So being able to kind of differentiate those things are important. Some of that's kind of parenting, but some of it also is, the journey to get into where we are.
Yeah. So a lot of the reasons behind why you wrote your book is the same reason why I started this podcast, because like you mentioned, your journey to success, when people see you on the platform, they think
Right.
sometimes you've always been on that platform. So
Right.
it's our responsibility to share our story, number one, and not only just share how well we did and the success, but also share the times when we thought that it might not come together, or the times when we failed,
Yeah.
because I feel that those failures and those setbacks are what people can really relate to and say, okay, yeah, Dr. Robinson, he's just like me. He's from the Bayou. Might have not had a lot coming up, but he's still a physician and he's still impacting others. So kudos to you for sharing your story, because that's what I encourage people. Your story is going to be told one way or the other. You can tell it in your version, or someone else will tell it for you.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And, one of the things I share in the book was that when I was finishing high school and contemplating going to college, I was afraid to even say, hey, I want to become a doctor, because I didn't have
Wow.
doctors in my family. And you remember what it was like when you went off to medical school. Probably everybody was like, hey, my baby Derrick or my boy Derrick is going to medical school.
Right.
All the hopes of the
Yeah.
family, of the
Yeah. The
village,
community.
on your
Yeah.
shoulders. And if you're
Yeah.
not successful, you feel like you've made this big failure. And so,
Right.
I was very hesitant to declare that. Once I had been directed that Xavier was going to be the great place for me to go, I felt comfortable saying, okay, hey, I want to do this. Then the next challenge I faced 4 years ago was, well, you can't get in. You keep banging on the door and everybody is saying no. But
Right.
each leg of our journeys are important. They're intentional. They have value. And so certainly as folks who are listening to this, they're still on their journey to their next station and they feel like they're encountering some barriers, just to know that those barriers have value, and you may not be able to appreciate the value of what you're working against right now until you get to that next station or the station beyond it. And you're able to look back and learn a lot from those lessons.
Absolutely. So on Time Out with the Sports Doctor, this is your final timeout. So, now you've completed the task of writing a book. You've achieved a lot throughout the years, despite the struggles or despite the setbacks. So what would you say to someone who's saying, man, I have a book that I want to write, but it's not going to be worth it because nobody's going to really want to hear my story. And they're, self-doubt and all the different things that you had to overcome to get your book actually out into the world. Just kind of talk to somebody about those, limiting factors that you had to overcome to write your book.
Yeah, I would say, well, the limits start with you. So your limits are inside of your head. And I think the sooner that you remove those limits, the faster you can begin to move. I would say just get started, take some time, begin, to write your thoughts down. You can work on sort of an outline to get you going. I found the developmental editing process to be very helpful for me after I wrote what I thought was the book.
Right.
To have someone else go and look at it and say, well, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about this? Or what did you mean by that? Or looks like you talked about this and you talked about that, but you left out something in the middle. Can you spend some time sort of filling in those gaps? That was really helpful to me. And at times I really enjoyed that, because I was like, oh, I didn't really think about that, but let me tell that story. And then the other thing that was really cool was just going back, reflecting through old documents, photos, artifacts, and things that I had kept along the way that I didn't know what I kept them for,
Right.
other than sort of historical purposes. But man, they
Yeah.
came in really handy when you need to go
Yeah.
back and figure out which year this happened and which year that happened, and what the quote was from someone that was really influential, that took time to write you a letter or a correspondence, or spend some time with you. So it can be rewarding from that perspective. And there's even a part of the book where I talked about some family illnesses and tragedies that we faced, and I found writing about that to be therapeutic in a sense as well, because there were some things that I was working through as from my dual role of being both family member and a physician, and
Right.
the dynamic tension of wondering, did you do enough? Are there things that you could have done better, and how will that impact your role as an advocate going forward? And the healthcare system that you spent so much time in miss your expectations, and how do you respond to that? So I found that to be very, very therapeutic from a writing perspective.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Hey, well, thank you for sharing this time with me. Tell the audience one more time how we'll put the information in the show notes, but tell them how they can get your book and, follow you along.
Yeah, happy to do that. So again, the title of the book is Improbable MD, From the Bayou to the Boardroom by Derrick Robinson. It's available wherever you get your book set. So you can get it Amazon, paperback, hardback, also Barnes & Noble. Ebooks are available. Also recently recorded the audiobook, so you can get it there as well. I'm on all of the social media channels, so you can get me on Twitter at the handle Dr.Derrick Robinson, or on Instagram at DRobMD. Dr. Burgess, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you.
Absolutely.
Excellent podcast. Thank you for giving me that extra time out. Appreciate it.
Hey, absolutely. Appreciate you for being here.
Thank you for continuing to support this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then please leave a 5-star review. And if you haven't done so, subscribe so you continue to get the updated episodes. Until later, peace.
Hey, TimeOut with the SportsDr. Keep our head right in the game. We ain't never stopping. You are now tuned in. Trust you don't want to miss. This is where life, sports, and medicine